Everybody knows that the Sega Genesis beat the Super Nintendo in the console wars, and anybody who thinks otherwise is dead to me. The 80s and 90s were great times to be a kid. Join me as I dive into the world of movies, music, video games and toys, and explore what made these decades so great. This is a Big Retro Show. Now, first of all, guys, I was joking. You are not really dead to me. I actually love the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis alike. But to me, in my opinion, there was one clear winner of the 90s console war. And that for me was the Sega Genesis. Now, this is a video that I've wanted to do ever since I was a teenager, ever since that this whole thing was happening back in the early 90s. And, you know, today I figured that I will give you my unpopular gaming opinion that turns out to be not so unpopular among you gamers today on this episode of My Unpopular Gaming Opinion. So, here we go. My opinion of who won the console wars isn't based on graphics, sound, AAA titles, controllers, look and feel, sales figures, or anything else that the talking heads have used to identify who won between the SNES and the Sega Genesis. As I've said before, I loved both systems and continue to do so today. No guys, my opinion is based on how the two companies handled one of the greatest fighting games ever created, and that is Mortal Kombat 1. The iconic Mortal Kombat was released in 1992 to rival its main competitor, Street Fighter II. The game was revolutionary for its time, not because of its use of digitized characters based on real people, but based on its ultra-violent fatalities. Each of the 7 playable characters had their own unique fatality that added a new level of anxiety, challenge, and fun for arcade players. Aside from the fatalities the characters could do, which included pulling hearts out of defeated players, ripping their spines out, electrocuting them, and several others, the game also allowed you to use environments to kill your opponents, such as sending them to their death in a bed of spikes. Now this was great stuff. Full disclosure though, I was a teenager and loved everything blood and guts. I kinda still do, but back then it was even more important to me. So I loved everything about Mortal Kombat. The game was a hit, and as such, was a natural fit for porting over to the SNES and the Genesis, the two home consoles that dominated the gaming landscape of the early 90s. Sorry TurboGrafx 16, I still love you. But this is where it gets interesting. You see, with all the fanfare and attention that the game received because of its violent content, it caught the eye of concerned parents who rallied together and approached lawmakers about the game.
Sega's version, blood splatters from the contestants' heads. When a player wins, the so-called death sequence begins. The game narrator instructs the player to finish, and I quote, finish his opponent. The player may then choose a method of murder, ranging from ripping a heart out to pulling off the head of the opponent with spinal cord attached. The second version, made by Nintendo, leaves out the blood and decapitation, but as you will see, it is still a violent game. For a lot of you to see, but there's blood splattering every time.
Kato wins. Flawless victor fatality. Sub-Zero win fatality.
And this is a brief sequence from the Nintendo version. The difference there, as you can see, is that that version does not have the finishing sequences, the death sequences, and in fact, instead of red blood spurting out, there's some other liquid, but it doesn't look like blood.
The parents also hated the Sega CD classic Night Trap, which I have never played, but I've always wanted to, and that's because Dana Plato was in it. And if you remember who Dana Plato is, she was Kimberly on Different Strokes. Yeah, some reason they hated all of the sexual promiscuity of the game, and they hated the violence. So on December 7th, 1993 and March 5th of 1994, the lawmakers began congressional hearings targeted directly at the level of sex and violence and the perceived impacts on children in games like Mortal Kombat and Night Trap.
We didn't want Nintendo's name associated with this kind of product. Even then, we were concerned about game content. So in 1985, when we launched our first Nintendo home video game system, we made a conscious business decision not to allow excessively violent, sexually explicit, or other offensive games in our system.
This all happened within the backdrop of escalating gun violence in the United States. And what basically happened was that the senators threatened to regulate the video game industry if they didn't come up with a way to police themselves and prevent violent video games from getting into the hands of youngsters.
Has resulted in the circulation of a number of distorted and inaccurate claims. The most damaging of these distortions, in my view, is the notion that Sega and the rest of the digital interactive industry are only in the business of selling games to children. This is not the case. Yes, many of Sega's interactive video titles are intended and purchased for young children. Many other Sega titles, however, are intended for and purchased by adults.
So the video game industry, in developing their rating systems, took from the motion picture industry that already had a well-established rating system. What they formed was the ESRB. Known today as the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, the ratings range from E to everyone to A for adults only. This is where my beef with Nintendo begins. You see, both the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo received the rights to port the game over. The two companies, however, took a very different approach to the game, which would make me lose respect for the SNES and subsequent Nintendo products throughout my adulthood. Not wanting to draw attention on itself and make the game accessible to small children and families without all the violence, Nintendo shipped the game without arcade-perfect fatalities and replaced the blood that so many of us grew fond of with sweat. Sega, on the other hand, shipped the game with the arcade fatalities and the blood. But in order to activate both fatalities and blood, you would need a code. The code came to be known as the blood code, and it was hidden within the game. It basically activated the blood that the SNES version was lacking. So I really love the way that Sega handled this. They taunted you right from the beginning and hinted at the code. Now as gamers, we would boot the game up and we would see this rant about a code, and we as gamers wondering, well, why is this in the beginning of the game? What does this mean? Why do I care about codes? And then it wasn't until the blood code was published in gaming magazines everywhere that we realized, aha, this is how you get blood. As a matter of fact, after putting the blood code in, the lettering would turn red, letting you know that you did it correctly. It was such a huge deal to be able to play Mortal Kombat as intended, fatalities and blood and all. And it cemented my opinion of the SNES as for being for a younger audience. The Sega Genesis, on the other hand, cemented itself as being for an older demographic. But perhaps even a bigger deal for me personally was the removal of the arcade-perfect fatalities in the SNES version. This was too lame for me to bear. Sub-Zero went from ripping the spine out of his opponent to freezing them and shattering the block of ice. Johnny Cage went from uppercutting the head off their opponent to giving them a super kick to the chest. It was like, what the fuck is that? Kano, whose fatality was ripping the heart out of his opponent, simply punched the enemy in the chest and raised his fist, but no heart in his hand. The only three characters whose fatalities remained intact were Scorpion, who roasts them with a fireball, Sonya Blade, who kisses a flame to her enemy and roasts them, and Liu Kang, who does a wicked uppercut.
Liu Kang wins.
But the Genesis was not immune to the lameness. You see, without the blood code, you would get normal, lame fatalities and you wouldn't get any blood. Where's the fun in that? The move to put the blood code into the Sega Genesis version paid off big time for Sega, as its version of Mortal Kombat outsold Nintendo's by 5-1. The way that the two companies handled Mortal Kombat also divided gamers, as it continues to do today. Having learned its lesson from the past with the poor sales of MK1, Nintendo included both blood and fatalities with the release of Mortal Kombat 2. The Sega version did as well, but this time players no longer needed a cheat code. But by that time I had already made up my mind of Super Nintendo. You see, to me it was a really lame move that they did, and I didn't want to play on a system that banned blood and fatalities and all of the good stuff that us teenagers like to play. So, you know, for me, it was the Sega Genesis that won the console wars simply because of Mortal Kombat 1. Now, don't get me wrong, I love both systems. I have both systems, and back in the day, I had them as well. But for me, the clear winner is the Sega Genesis. Now, I know that you guys have opinions about who won the console wars. You know, some of you are on Team Super Nintendo and some of you are on the Sega Genesis. And I have to admit that I kind of cheated with this version of my unpopular gaming opinion, because there's a lot of you guys that feel the same way as I do, and this is a not so unpopular gaming opinion. But anyways, let me know in the comments who you think won the console war of the 90s and why. That's what I'm interested in. And so guys, that's going to be it for the Big Retro Show's My Unpopular Gaming Opinion. If you have an unpopular gaming opinion and would like to be featured in this show without getting all of the hate comments in your own videos, then hit me up on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, and we will schedule you for a taping. And with that, guys, I will see you on the next Big Retro Show. Peace!